Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, join me each episode as we discuss all things guitar. So, for anyone who's interested in Eric Clapton and his long and pretty prolific career, there is really two distinct eras. The first would be the Clapton is God Beano album Cream era, where we see Clapton playing almost exclusively Gibson guitars into Marshall amplifiers. And if you're not familiar with my Beano album episode that I did a few episodes back, go back and check that out. It'll really give you some insights into how that album was made and just really the Marshall and Les Paul combo thing. And Clapton's really kind of responsible for kicking that off, the Les Paul into Marshall thing. So go back and check that episode out if you haven't already. But in this episode, I want to kind of talk about the Fender era of Clapton, and in particular, two very, very important Strats in the world of blues rock and even pop music to some extent as time went on. But we're really going to focus on his time with Delaney and Bonnie, into Blind Faith, and then ultimately into Derek and the Dominoes, and then his solo projects, all of his solo albums that he would do after that. And really two very, very important Strats, as I said. The first one would be Brownie, and the second one, of course, is probably the most famous Clapton Strat, which we know as Blackie. So we're going to talk a little bit about these guitars and kind of what albums we saw them on, what important songs were performed and recorded, and what, just kind of what is up with these two guitars. Because like you, probably, I've always heard about these guitars. I mean, we all know Brownie and we all, of course, know Blackie, but I didn't really know much of the history. A little bit, you hear things here and there, you might read something, but I wanted to find out a bit more about these guitars. So join me as we dive into an exploration of these two extraordinary guitars and learn a little bit more about the Brownie and Blackie era Clapton. While many people think of Clapton's Black Strat, Blackie, as his signature guitar, it was actually Brownie that introduced Clapton to the Stratocaster and helped shape some of the greatest guitar recordings ever made. It was an instrument that carried him into a completely new chapter of his career and became the sound of some truly legendary albums. So by 1967, Eric Clapton had already become one of the biggest names in rock guitar through his work with the Yardbirds, John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and Cream. And up to that point, he was known almost exclusively as a Gibson player, favoring Les Paul's SGs and that famous Cherry 335. But then on May 7th of 1967, while still a member of Cream, Clapton walked into Sound City Music in London and bought a used 1956 Fender Stratocaster for around $400. It was the very first Strat he ever owned. Interestingly, he purchased it only a few days before Cream flew to New York to record Disraeli Gears, although the guitar wouldn't immediately become his main instrument. For the next couple of years, Clapton continued to play mostly Gibsons with Cream, and Brownie spent much of its time waiting in the wings. So let's talk about some of the specs of this guitar. So as we said, Brownie is a 1956 Fender Stratocaster. It has an alder body, a two-tone sunburst finish, a maple neck and fingerboard, black dot position markers, vintage synchronized tremolo, single-ply white pickguard, 3 vintage-style single-coil pickups, and the serial number is 12073. And by the time Clapton bought it, the guitar already had some noticeable wear. Over the years, of course, he added a whole lot more, including the famous cigarette burns on the headstock that became part of its unmistakable appearance. Although Clapton owned the guitar beginning in 1967, he didn't fully embrace the Stratocaster until late '69, when he became inspired by players such as Buddy Holly, Buddy Guy, Hank Marvin, and especially Steve Winwood. The Strat's brighter tone and expressive vibrato offered a very different voice from the thick humbucker sound he had been known for. And once he made the switch, there's really never been any looking back. Brownie made its first recording debut on Clapton's 1970 self-titled solo album, Eric Clapton. If you've ever heard classics like After Midnight, Blues Power, or Let It Rain, you're hearing the sound of Brownie paired with vintage Fender amplifiers. The guitar also appears prominently on the album cover, making it instantly recognizable to fans. Of course, Brownie's most famous moment came later in that same year. Clapton formed Derek and the Dominoes, and Brownie became his primary guitar for recording Layla and other assorted love songs. That means the unmistakable Strat sounds we hear on Layla, Bell Bottom Blues, Why Does Love Gotta Be So Bad, Tell the Truth, and Keep On Growing largely came from this 1956 Stratocaster. The contrast between Clapton's bright Strat and Duane Allman's 1959 Gibson Les Paul created one of the most celebrated dual guitar sounds ever captured on record. Brownie is even pictured on the back of the Layla album. In 1999, Clapton auctioned Brownie to raise money for the Crossroads Center, his addiction recovery facility in Antigua. The guitar sold for $450,000, setting a world record for the highest price ever paid for a guitar at auction at that time. But a few years later, Blackie would break that record. Today, Brownie remains one of the most historically significant Stratocasters ever built. Brownie represents much more than just another vintage Fender. It marks the moment Eric Clapton reinvented his sound. His earlier reputation had been built around the thick Gibson tones through Marshall amplifiers. Brownie introduced an audience to a cleaner, brighter, more expressive voice that would influence generations of Strat players, including names like Mark Knopfler, John Mayer, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and countless others. And without Brownie, there's a good chance there would have never been Blackie. And without those two guitars, the sound of modern blues and rock guitar might have evolved very differently. So by the end of 1970, Clapton had completely fallen in love with Fender Stratocasters. Ironically, at the time, vintage 50 Strats weren't considered collectible. In fact, they were almost unfashionable. While touring with Derek and the Dominoes, Clapton stopped into the famous Show Bud music store in Nashville and discovered 6 used mid-1950s Strats hanging on the wall. They were selling for roughly $100 to $300 each, a small fraction of what they're worth today. And Clapton bought all 6. After returning to England, Clapton gave 3 of those guitars away to close friends: George Harrison, Pete Townsend, and Steve Winwood. Then he looked at the remaining 3 and decided to build the ultimate Strat. He loved the black 1956 body appearance, preferred the feel of a 1957 maple neck, and chose the electronics and pickups from another guitar that he thought simply sounded better. The result wasn't an original 56 or 57 Strat. It was what Clapton affectionately called a mongrel, a parts guitar built from the best pieces of several vintage instruments. The black finish inspired the simple nickname, Blackie. Blackie made its public debut on January 13, 1973 at the famous Rainbow Concert in London. Organized by Pete Townsend, the concert marked Clapton's return to performing after overcoming serious heroin addiction. From that night forward, Blackie rarely left his hands. For the next 12 years, it became his primary stage and studio guitar. If you think about Eric Clapton's classic solo tone during the 70s and even into the early 80s, you're probably hearing Blackie. The guitar appears on many of his biggest recordings, including music from 461 Ocean Boulevard in 1974. His cover of Bob Marley's I Shot the Sheriff was a massive hit. There's One in Every Crowd from 1975, No Reason to Cry from 1976, and of course, the epic Slow Hand from 1977, featuring huge hits like J.J. Cale cover Cocaine, Wonderful Tonight, and Lay Down Sally. Also Backless in 1978, and Just One Night in 1980, which features a super memorable live version of Layla. Money and Cigarettes in 1983, and Behind the Sun in 1985. Throughout this era, Blackie became synonymous with Clapton's cleaner Strat tones, rich sustain, expressive vibrato, and tasteful blues phrasing. Blackie wasn't just a studio instrument. It appeared during some of rock's most iconic performances. You can see it on Martin Scorsese's legendary concert film, The Last Waltz, where Clapton joined the band for an unforgettable performance. It was also his main guitar during the Arms charity concerts in 1983 and Live Aid in 1985, introducing Blackie to millions of television viewers around the world. Unlike many celebrity guitarists that spend their lives in cases, Blackie worked for a living. Night after night, tour after tour, album after album. The frets were replaced countless times. The electronics were serviced. The original three-way switch eventually became a five-way. The maple neck became so worn from decades of playing that Clapton decided that the guitar had earned its retirement. After the U.S. leg of the Behind the Sun tour in 1985, Blackie officially stepped down as his primary instrument. But Blackie wasn't completely finished. Clapton occasionally brought it out for special appearances during the late 1980s and early 1990s. But from that point on, he mainly played the newer Fender-developed Eric Clapton signature Stratocaster, which borrowed much of Blackie's feel while adding modern features like active electronics and a mid-boost circuit. And finally, in 2004, Clapton decided that Blackie could do one more good deed. He auctioned the guitar through Christie's to benefit his Crossroads Center. Blackie sold for $959,500, making it the most expensive guitar ever sold at auction at that time. Today, it remains one of the most recognizable Strats ever built. So that's a little history on the most famous Eric Clapton Stratocasters. And while Brownie may not be as instantly recognizable as Blackie, many fans would argue it's actually the more historically important guitar. It was the instrument that carried Clapton through his first solo record, helped create Layla and other assorted love songs, and it was ultimately the catalyst for the shift for Eric Clapton from the Gibson sound to the Fender sound. And on its own, a 1956 Strat like Brownie would be worth quite a bit of money today, even if it hadn't been owned by Eric Clapton. And I think that's what makes Blackie so much different. It's not all original, it's the sum of a bunch of different guitars, and because all those parts are from the 50s, it would inevitably be worth a bit of money today, but certainly nowhere near the money that it brought at auction, and it made that much money simply because of the legendary music that it helped create in the hands of one of the most important blues rock guitarists of all time. I know a lot of players would cite Clapton's Gibson years, especially his work with Cream, as the most influential in terms of important guitar work. But I really feel like the things that he did later in his career with the Strat were some of his best. And you could argue that the majority of the famous music he made with the Stratocaster, not a Gibson into Marshall. And although in his later career, the only notable exception where he moved away from the Strat to something else was the From the Cradle album in the 90s, when he went back to the cherry red ES-335 for a large part of that album. But pretty much everything he's done since he first got Brownie up to today has been done with a Stratocaster. Fender Custom Shop also released a limited edition Eric Clapton Blackie replica in 2006, which sold for $24,000 at the time. It was limited to 275, and they were master-built replicas. All 185 US market models sold out within 7 minutes of their release, and a portion of the proceeds from each guitar went directly to benefit Eric Clapton's Crossroads Center in Antigua. You'll see them pop up for sale on some online forums from time to time, but they're still bringing well in excess of $20,000. And if that's a little outside your budget, but you want some of that Eric Clapton Blackie mojo, you can buy the Fender Custom Shop team-built version for around $5,000, or the standard USA-made Eric Clapton signature for around $2,300. And you can find variations of either of those used online for quite a bit less than that. Alright, well, if you've enjoyed this look at Clapton's two famous Strats, Brownie and Blackie, please make sure and share the episode with a guitar-playing friend. Also, wherever you're listening right now, take a second to leave a 5-star review, which helps me tremendously. When you get over to YouTube at some point in the very near future, make sure to search Shad's Guitar Show and subscribe and check out some of the content there. And also when you're on Instagram, follow me at Shad's Guitar Show. And don't forget, the best guitarist is the one having the most fun.